So this week on the Vinyl Guide, we have with us a man whose name is likely on many of the albums you have in your collection, and the reason they sound so good. World-renowned audio mastering engineer Bernie Grundman. How you doing today, Bernie?
Very good. I'm sitting here ready to talk.
Excellent. Well, we're ready to listen. So, Bernie, in your history of doing audio mastering, how do you approach a project that is either on vinyl or digital or CD? With the field so wide now in various formats, how is it that you approach each of those formats?
Well, yeah, they are quite a bit different actually in uh, what they're able to reproduce. Put it that way, because vinyl, of course, is based on a very primitive format. It goes all the way back to the 19th century with Edison, and it's just been refined, but it's still the basic principle is very primitive. So, but of course, it's sophisticated with stereo, two channels in one groove, and so on, and full frequency response. However, the big problem with vinyl is reproducing it, and that's why you have such a wide range of prices for playback cartridges, because what you're really doing is doing something mechanical. So you've got a stylus is trying to follow a very complex signal, and it has to be very compliant. It has to be able to move fast. It has to have all these parameters covered before it can reproduce what's in that groove. We can cut in the disc much more than you can play back. So we have to be careful about that. Now, when it comes to digital, the comparison is that digital only has one limitation. It only has the limitation of peak level. You can make that thing as bright as you want as long as you don't exceed the maximum peak level, which will cause clipping and cause distortion. But in digital, whatever you're doing, you get pretty much what you're sending it. However, it does have those other things that people don't like about it, certain artifacts and certain things that happen depending on the kind of processing that's done. And there's always this other aspect that tends to creep in when you're doing a lot of digital processing that isn't even musical. It kind of creates kind of a sound of its own, and it kind of affects everything. So, I mean, there's a certain purity with vinyl, but vinyl, we have to be very careful. That's why there's a lot more to it. You really have to have a lot of experience when you're doing vinyl, because so many things might not track too well, and you have to figure out how to solve the problem, how to get it to track properly and cleanly, but you want to do it so that you're going to change it the least amount from what you ideally would like to have, because sometimes you just can't get what you would prefer. It's just too distorted. It won't follow it.
So that's interesting because when you have we'll start with the digital format. You have a CD player or whatever digital player you have. You're right. It is an algorithm. It is a digital to audio conversion. The variability then comes within the receiver, the speakers, and the environment. But of course, with records, you have all that plus the contact of the needle and the groove and the cartridge. How do those components affect the quality of the conversion from the sound on the surface into the receiver in the system?
Well, that's kind of what I was alluding to when I was describing it, generally describing it. But what happens in anything that we're dealing with here, when it comes to audio, we have to get it into analog form so that we can hear it. So what we have is the things that are doing big conversions, like speakers. They convert electrical energy into mechanical energy, because they have to move the cones and the diaphragms and all of that. That's a very critical area, and that's the hardest thing to do. Same way with disc cutting or disc playback systems. When you're changing the mechanical movement of that stylus to electrical, that's the big problem. How can we really faithfully do that? And that's why you have cartridges that are maybe $10,000 even. So as you get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, it's not going to track especially high frequencies. Those are the hardest things to track because they're fast movements. High frequencies are very, we're going all the way out to 20,000 cycles. So, and some transients and so forth, in essence, really have a high frequency as far as the leading edge is concerned. So that nice, snappy, clear attack on things gets better and better the better the cartridge is.
So I guess I'm trying to think of a visual for this. So let's say there's we shrink ourselves down to the size of a record groove. We go inside the record groove, and it'll look like a bit of a valley. The big boulders, the big chunks are the low end sounds, the low frequencies, and the small details are the high frequencies. So it's a little bit harder for a moving needle to be able to pick up those delicate, small, detailed grooves or marks within the groove than it is it's much easier for them to be able to hit those big boulders because they're so large and unmissable. Is that have that right?
Well, that's part of it, but see, it's the speed. See, when you have high frequencies, the stylus has to move laterally or vertically for that matter, depending on where the signal is, whether it's on the left channel, right channel, or in the center. But it has to move fast. It has to really go back and forth, say it's a mono signal. It has to just move back and forth really fast. It's not as hard to track low end, actually. Low end is a very slow moving groove. It might look really radical under a microscope, but most styluses can handle it. If they can't handle it, they probably jump out of the groove, because it does move the stylus a little further, but it doesn't move it as fast. And if it can't respond fast, you're going to get what we call splatter, like on sibilant S's and things like that, those high frequencies in a female vocalist's S's. If it can't follow that real quick burst of high frequencies, it's going to splatter. You get this tearing sound. So that's probably the biggest problem we have in disc cutting. And what I was saying earlier, it's a moving target, because how do you decide what quality of cartridge is going to be playing the record that you're working on? I mean, audiophile guys usually have pretty good playback systems, the arm and cartridge and all of that's very kind of expensive stuff, and it's probably tracks better than, say, these $100 ones that you buy at a five and dime store practically. So we have to make those decisions too. We have like a good all around cartridge that we use. That's it's probably around the $500 range, 400, 500, and if it tracks on that, we're pretty happy with it, but we always like to have the client listen to it on a few other players to make sure it's going to track in the areas that it's going to be played. With audiophiles, we can tend to go a little further. We tend to put on more information because we know they probably have better cartridges. But you could line up 10 different playback machines with different cartridges, and your record's going to sound different on all of them.
So when you approach a project, you also look at who will be the likely listener then.
That's right.
Okay. So
that's exactly right.
So a high-end jazz record or, some sort of music that an audiophile would tend to listen to more, you treat slightly differently than you would, let's say, lack of a better artist, Adele, who a lot of her records probably end up on some of the cheaper turntables.
Yeah, so we have to be careful there. We try to make a determination. Like if we do something like Adele, we with our experience, if you have a lot of experience in this, you kind of can tell, even if you're tracking it clean in the studio when you're doing test cuts, because we do a lot of test cuts to see how it's tracking. That's the only way you're going to know. And so we're listening to these things, and even though it might be tracking clean, we can tell when it's getting on the edge of maybe starting to distort. And so we put in a high frequency limiter or some way of taking some of the energy out of those S's so that we're pretty sure then it'll track on, say, a lesser quality playback.
How many cuts do you do each day?
Now, we do a lot of work where we're doing just off of files that people send us from other mastering places, because when it comes to disc cutting, there are many That I mean there aren't as many at all mastering places that do vinyl, that do actual mastering for vinyl, because there's so much more to it than doing a CD master. I mean, it's way more complicated. It takes much more maintenance, takes a lot more experience. As I was saying before, CDs only have one limitation. You don't have to worry so much about CDs. It's pretty easy. But when it comes to doing vinyl, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong, because here's another aspect. As you know, probably, I mean, the disc is constantly changing quality. So the quality is much better on the outer circumferences than on the inner circumferences. So as you're playing that disc from the outer edge to the inside, the quality is constantly, slowly dropping, getting less and less, because the density is increasing. And what's really happening is the linear speed of the disc is actually going like 4 times faster on the outer edge than it is on the inner edge toward the label. That's why a good audiophile record, you don't want to cut close to the label, because it's just, no matter if you have the best cartridge in the world, if you have to cut a full side close to the label, you're not going to get all the information that was put in that groove.
Do you have any influence in terms of the sequencing of albums, or is that already done by the time it gets to your hands?
No, they usually want it in the same sequence they put it in when they made the CD.
So we're going to get back to some of this because it's absolutely fascinating. But before we do, I want to hear a bit about your background. How did you come to the conclusion that audio engineering was your talent?
Well, I've kind of known the area that I would be interested in when I was about 7 years old or 8 years old, because I was fascinated by just my dad would play records now and then at our house, and I just that was starting to interest me there. And but I didn't really commit myself to it completely until one day, and this was when I've been raised in part of my life in Arizona, in Phoenix, Arizona, which is a small town at the time, and high fidelity was just, I've been in this business 50 years, but this was when I was a teenager, before I got in the business. But I was I was working for a film library, actually. The old 16 millimeter films, they'd run them at the parks and at schools and things. But it's because I was interested in movies and so forth. And then I had a motor scooter or something, and I was driving by a new shop. It was called High Fidelity Sound Systems. And being a person that is attracted to anything electronic or like motion picture machines and all of these kind of things, I mean, I always knew what attracted me. I mean, it went directly into me. Mm-hmm. I had nothing in my way. I didn't have influence from my parents saying that I should be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. I just liked what I liked, and it went directly to whatever my passion would be. So anyway, I would go by this place every day, and I would see, in those days, the speakers and everything were just sitting out on shelves, and they had, like, you could build your own speaker cabinets and things, and it interested me. So I stopped in one day, and the guy that ran the store, I was looking at all this stuff. I'm like 14 or 15 years old. I'm looking at all this equipment and drooling over it. Like there was a Macintosh 30 there, that nice chrome amplifier. And so the guy says to me, he says, "Hey, let me play you a record." And I thought, oh, okay, great. So he puts this record on, and it was like the world changed completely for me. When I heard that sound, from that day on, it was all over. It was only records and audio equipment. So I ended up, within a very short time, I had in my 12 by 12 bedroom, I had 2 turntables, some Marantz amplifiers. I had 2 Bozak Concert Grands. Each speaker had 14 speakers in it, in a 12 by 12 bedroom.
Your dad's audio system was no longer sufficient for.
Oh no. Oh yeah, I went my own way, but I was totally sold, and I mean it's been that way. So I've always been an audiophile first. So it was I suppose, and I never thought. I actually got a job at that hi-fi shop, for a while, and they only brought in contemporary records. If you, I'm sure you all know about Sonny Rollins' Way Out West and Art Pepper Meets the Rhythm Section, these really great sounding recordings from that period. I ended up, my first job in Hollywood, at Contemporary Records. So I was like, was in heaven, you know, but see, my enthusiasm and my dedication to it, that people saw something I didn't see in myself. I didn't realize that I had that kind of, you know, passion. I mean, I was just doing what I felt I needed to do. But it was, I didn't know how it compared to other people, but people saw that in me, which was really nice, you know, and gave me opportunities and so forth. But I didn't really quite understand what they saw. They just knew that I was interested, really interested.
So you went from having a big sound system, from enjoying, consuming audio. How do you make that turn into then creating the records?
Well, you know, I was also a big music fan. You know, I was a big listener. You know, it's very interesting. It's ironic because my success, a lot of it's based on a lot of R&B, like Michael Jackson, people like that, Prince, R&B and a lot of pop music and so forth, which is kind of interesting. But my real love is bebop jazz and classical. So I was like really into that beatnik period, or the period where bebop was really big in the 50s. And I even had when I was 19, I had an after hours coffee house that featured bebop jazz. So I was really, you know, pretty ambitious in a lot of areas, but still audio was always my main passion. And I think what happened is I was kind of playing drums and I was, you know, kind of hanging out with all the musicians. And I got to the point though where I went in the Air Force. And but during the time in the Air Force, I really did some thinking about, hey, I got to get on track here. And I really knew where my main passion was. So I made a decision while I was way up in Glasgow, Montana, way up in northeast Montana, right next to Canada, where it was 40 below in the winter. I was in electronic warfare, and I was on a big SAC base with B-52 bombers and working on all of the jamming equipment. And I decided while I was there, which was 3 years, I decided, boy, when I get out of here, I know what I'm going for directly. So when I got out of the Air Force, I got in my car and I drove all the way from right next to North Dakota and Montana, way up in the corner, right to Hollywood. And I walked into Capitol Records and I went into the head of recording. I said, okay, what do I have to do? I want to be a recording engineer. I really didn't care where I worked in the business. I just wanted to be in it, around it, and hang out and manipulate sound and various things like that. So the guy was very non-committal, of course. You know, he couldn't just give me a job, and I didn't know anything at the time. But I said, well, what should I do? Should I go and, you know, complete a degree in electrical engineering? Would that help? And because I was studying that, and he wasn't sure. He said, well, it'd probably help, blah, blah. So I went back to Phoenix, and I was, you know, going with that curriculum, you know, mathematics and all that kind of stuff. But I also got a job at the studio in Phoenix, the main studio there. I just told him I had to work there. Because it's interesting. The guy that, when I called him up and said, I really want to be in the recording industry, and the guy that owned the company said, well, you ought to talk to Roy Dunan. And I said, Roy Dunan, he works at your studio? Because this is the guy that did all the contemporary records. And I said, oh, I'll come right down. So I came down there and I told the guy, I says, look, Roy Dunan works here. I have to work here. It's really important. I says, you don't need to pay me. I just want to come in and you tell me anything you want me to do. I don't care. I just have to be here. And the guy's like, well, okay, yeah, you can come by, you know. So, but by going there and hanging out and learning what I could pick up, I met Howard Holzer, who was his partner at Contemporary. And Roy was in Phoenix because his wife had health problems, and he had left Contemporary Records. But I went to, so I was working there and going to Arizona State University. And this is kind of a very American story anyway, because I came in one Monday and Roy Dunan said to me, he says, you should have been here this weekend. Howard Holzer was here to check out the cutting systems and so forth. He's quite a person. You'd probably like to know him because they knew I was interested in really getting in more further and further into recording and the whole operation. And they said this, he'd be somebody to know and so forth. And he's got this, all he was doing then was building cutting systems in Van Nuys, California, right next to LA, right part of LA. So I hopped in my car and I went to Van Nuys. And I walked in. I walked in, and here's Howard Holzer, in a T-shirt, eating soup out of a soup pan, and in his shop. He didn't need to dress for anyone.
Very glamorous.
Yeah, no, I know. And here I come in with a suit and tie, right? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to present myself. So I had a suit and tie on. I walk in, and he says, yeah, Roy told me about you. Yeah, he says, and I was talking to him for a while, and he says, hey, Contemporary doesn't have an engineer over there. Why don't you go get the job over there? And I says, what do you mean, Howard? I don't know anything. I've only been there 3 or 4 months at Audio Recorders and just hanging around. He says, and he said the key word. He said to me, he said, look, he says, if you love your work, you're going to find a way. And it just stunned me. And I thought, wow. And so I went back and I realized that I really didn't want to design this stuff particularly. I wanted to just work in the studio and work with artists and work with sound and work with manipulating it and so forth, because I'd been around that studio for a while. So I called Howard like in February or March or something, and I said, Howard, is that job still available at Contemporary? Because I thought if I really put my mind to it, I could pick up enough at the studio in Phoenix and actually work there. And Howard said, hey, yeah, he said, I'll set up, I said, I'm going to get out of summer school in August. Can you set up an interview with Lester Koenig, the guy that owned Contemporary? And he says, yeah, I'm sure I can set it up for you. I says, great. I says, I'll come over right after my final exams in August. So about 2 weeks before I would be going over to LA, I thought I better see if this is months after, I says, I better see if he got me that interview. So I called up Howard and I says, Howard, did you get that interview with Lester? He says, I got you the job. When can you start?
Yeah.
And I said, what? So I didn't know what to think. So I drove over there right away, as soon as I could, right after the exams. And Howard took me over to Lester's. I'd never even been to Contemporary. He took me over there and introduced me to Lester. And Lester says, Howard says you're terrific. When can you start? And I thought, what? I mean, these guys don't even know me. So here I am in September then, just a month later, with my car and a trailer and all my all my belongings, and I'm moving to LA.
Wow, what a head spin.
I used to drive over to LA from time to time anyway, just to get the vibe, because it was so exciting to me.
Mm-hmm. And what year was this?
This was, I actually started that in 1966. And see, the interesting thing about it is, now here's an interesting aspect of mastering. Mastering engineers were called mastering engineers because that's all they did. They cut a master disc. So if you were at Columbia, or if you were at RCA or Capitol or any of those places in the 50s, you didn't do anything to the sound. It was not a creative process. It was a mechanical process. You had to know how to mechanically make a disc that would track well. And they had all these parameters about an LP of this length was going to be this level. Of this length, it would be a different level, maybe if it's a long one, or 45s would be a certain level. and you all you did was transfer that master tape to the lacquer, and you had to know how to cut a disc, but you didn't manipulate it, possibly putting in like high frequency limiter or something. But if the producer needed to change the sound on, say, track number 2, he had to go back in the studio and make a tape copy with the new EQ and insert it in the assembly, give it to the mastering engineer, and the mastering engineer would cut it flat. So he was called a mastering engineer. Well, when I got in, Contemporary, because it was a directed 2-track place, it was custom made for just what they were doing, jazz records. They had all kinds of equalization in the line because they went direct to 2-track. Then it was rough sometimes, some of the mixes, but in jazz, if it's a good performance, you want to keep that at whatever you have to do to manipulate the sound. So they had special equalizers that you could pan different parts of the spectrum. You could pan them to the center, pan them different places. Sometimes it would take Lester and me 2 days a couple days to cut a set of lacquers, because we'd have to like choreograph the whole thing, because we'd have all this equalization changes and we'd actually be adjusting it as if we were mixing while it went. So I learned a lot at Contemporary because of all of this stuff. But the thing, what happened is, word got around LA that I could manipulate the sound. They wouldn't have to make copies. They wouldn't have to do all of this. They could come in and on the fly, I could change equalization from tune to tune as well as level. And I started to get this big reputation in mastering. But also what was happening, because of my adjustments to the sound, it was becoming a creative part. That's why I call mastering the last creative step and the first step of manufacturing, because that's what it's doing now with a lot of people, except when we get files and we're just going to do as if we were back in the 50s, just transfer them straight across and only correct for various high frequency problems and so forth. But a lot of times we do all of the adjustments as well, the equalization and so forth. And that's the creative part.
So you start having influence in shaping the sound of contemporary records.
Yeah, that's what started to happen.
Yeah, and audibly people heard the difference. You started building a reputation. How long did you stay at Contemporary?
I was only there for 2 years, and then I was doing all of A&M's work, and I was doing a lot of electro work, the Doors and people like that. Burt Bacharach, Herb Alpert, and Procol Harum.
Did you do the Doors' first album?
Not the first one, no. No, some of the first albums, I wasn't on the scene then, I don't think. But yeah, I was doing a lot of work for those two places, but then A&M bought that lot, the Charlie Chaplin lot in Hollywood, and they were going to put in all their own studios. So it was my opportunity, because I was doing almost all of A&M's work. So I talked to Herb about it, Herb Alpert, and next thing I know, I was in charge of their mastering.
Clarify something for me here. I'm a bit confused. When an album comes out, let's say Michael Jackson Thriller, and it says on it, mastered by Bernie Grundman, does that mean that every copy of Thriller, vinyl, cassette, CD, even 8-track, is a descendant of the mastering work that you've done? Or are there other people who've done other masters, maybe in other countries or other formats, that sort of thing?
Well, no, it's not supposed. Yeah, it should be exactly what I did. Now, occasionally we do tailor something for a certain format. We might change the sound. Like sometimes when we're doing singles from albums, we might hype them up a little bit, or do a little more compression, or sometimes we would do things like that. But whatever was done usually was done by the original mastering engineer in those days.
For an album like Michael Jackson Thriller, you would have to have dozens of lacquers cut. Yeah?
I probably cut 120 sets on that album.
Wow.
Over a 2 or 3 year period. There was so many records being pressed that they kept running out of stampers and running out of mothers and so forth, and we had to keep cutting lacquers.
So when an album comes out that is going to be big, let's say the next Michael Jackson album was bad, at the time of mastering, you do a couple dozen lacquers just right off the bat?
Well, we used to do. They had 3 plants like for Michael Jackson, Columbia had 3 plants, one in the middle of the country, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. And we would cut 6 sets for each plant to begin with. Now, and of course, in those days, unfortunately, they used to push those stampers and mothers and so forth further than they do in the audiophile world. They would make more mothers than they do for audiophile records, and the quality would vary depending on where your pressing came from in that chain. But each lacquer can maybe, with good quality, each lacquer can make about 16 sets of masters, of stampers, I should say, stampers. Because a lacquer makes one negative, which is a metal master. We call it a metal master, the first step.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then it's a negative. Then it can make a mother, which is a positive, and that's what they check in the plant to see what the quality of it's like. They play it. They can play it. It's metal. It's made out of nickel, but they can play it, and they can check the quality and make sure that the plating went well. And then they make a stamper from the mother. Okay, so that's this 3-step process. Now, the metal master, the first step one, could make maybe 4 mothers, and each mother can make 4 stampers. That's why there's 16 stampers. Now, each stamper, they don't like to press more than 500 with audiophile stuff. But, they used to sell millions back then. So
Mm-hmm.
you know that they were pushing these things a little further than they should.
Well, certainly more than 500. I mean, I think
Well, no,
each stamper is generally good for close to, I want to say, 8 to 10,000. Is that the rule of thumb?
well, I think a lot of audiophiles maybe get 1,000, but oh yeah, I think when it's just a mainstream pop thing, they probably do. I mean, I haven't talked to the plant for a while. I don't know what they're doing now, but I'm thinking those days, yes, they could do quite a few off of each stamper. But see, the problem is because vinyl is a very hard material. Even though it's liquefied somewhat when they press it, it still wears out stampers. And the first few might have little noise things and stuff. That's what they say. But the first run is probably going to sound better than, say, the 8,000th disc, because it just wears, and you can hear that. It's pure analog. Anything in that groove, you're going to hear. And anything it picks up, any little dust or dirt that gets in there, you're going to hear it. It's pure analog.
It's like the soles of your shoes. When you first get the shoes, it's nice and crisp and it's all defined. And if you step in mud, then you could make a clean impression. But, after 6 months of wearing those shoes, it's all worn down unevenly and you're not going to get that sort of detail.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And we find also that, it seems like everything seems to change. Like I know when we were doing a lot of the classic records, we would cut 3 sets of masters, and they would be cut one right after the other, and then the classic records would get test pressings on all 3 of the different that were stampers that were made from each of the 3 masters, and they all sounded a little different. It's really odd how almost everything makes a difference. Just subtle differences, but they're just not exactly the same. It just has to do with how it plated, the temperatures in the plating bath. Who knows what it is? The cycle time even makes a difference in the press when they're pressing records. And even the press makes a difference. Like the difference between an alpha press and an SMT press, you can hear the difference. There's a different sound depending on the press you press it on. And it's inherent. It's going to be always different.
So you just mentioned an alpha and an SMT press. What are those?
Okay. Well, SMTs were American-made presses a long time ago. They don't make them anymore. But the Alpha, 2Lex Alpha, are those Swedish presses. That there's probably more of those around than anything. They use them at RTI. But a lot of these plants have some of each. So in Europe, you usually see the Tulex Alpha ones, those, like I said, the Swedish ones. And they're very, they're very refined, but they're not, in some ways, they're not as, they don't sparkle as much to me, but they're quite good. They're both very good. It's just that they have a different personality, because nothing's going to be perfect. When we compare pressings to the lacquer, it's never as good. There's no way that even doing a mechanical process, it's not a re-recording process like tape and so forth, where you automatically are going to lose something. But just doing the mechanical thing of plating and then pressing and putting it in a different material, vinyl, it's definitely not as good as the lacquer. The lacquer is pristine. You could stand here and I could put my playback on while I'm cutting, because we have a playback right on the cutting system, playback arm, and for calibration and so forth. But we can cut and play back, so it's like just a half second after you're cutting a signal, you can switch to the playback. And if you were cutting on the outer edge of just a regular LP, you'd be hard pressed to hear the difference. It's that close. But you would tell the difference if it was a vinyl pressing.
So, are you able to enjoy music on a personal level without deconstructing it constantly?
Oh, yeah. No, I don't really have any problem with that.
Okay.
No, I mean, I have a tendency to kind of make an evaluation, but it doesn't really get in my way. I don't really dwell on it, or I don't, I just, if it's good music, it's attractive anyway. I mean, I listen to some stuff that's not very well recorded, some of the old jazz stuff, but I get plenty of enjoyment out of it because the music is so good.
Okay. You're able to shut off that little voice in the back of your head that says, wow, that could use some compression. That could use some.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that voice might be there, but I'm not obsessive about stuff like that. But let me just I want to point something out that you mentioned something about it before, about the groove, how it looks, and those canyons and all this stuff. I think that to really simplify it, I mean, if you just think of it as what's in the groove is a miniaturization of pretty much exactly what you want the speaker to do. Okay, if the groove, if you're going along and the groove goes left to right, boom, boom, from a kick drum, it's miniaturized in the groove, but the cone in the speaker does exactly the same thing. It's just amplified from the cartridge. And so that cartridge is vibrating the same way you want the speaker to vibrate. So, or to move, you put it that way. So the only difference is now, I mean, there's other things that are done, like the RIAA curve. It's cut like on a curve. So there's a modification of the spectrum for various reasons, and then it's reconverted when it's played back on your phono part of your preamp. The phono part of the preamp has a reciprocal circuit. So what happens is, I'm not sure, and maybe some of your people that are going to hear this don't understand why they did it, why there's an RIAA curve, and what is the RIAA curve. Well, the RIAA curve was a method because of LP. When LPs first came out in 1949, they were trying to look for a way of saving space on the record, getting more time on the record. So that meant they cut lower level compared to 78s. They cut lower level so that it wouldn't take as much space, because the louder you cut it, the more that thing's going to move. So the grooves have to be spaced further apart. So they cut lower level. Now the thing that takes up the most space is bottom end. So they rolled off the bottom end. So the bottom end is much less on the disc than what's going to end up on your speaker. Now on top of that, they boosted the top end. Now they did this because, being low level, you're getting down into a fixed noise floor of the vinyl. So on playback, if you boost the high end on record, when you're recording the disc, when you're making the disc, cutting it, but when you press it, there's a certain amount of noise floor that's on that vinyl, but your preamp is going to take the high frequencies down. It's going to reciprocate, but what comes down with it is the surface noise of the record. So now we've been able to, and if it's a good pressing, it's pretty good, being able to get all of that information in a small area. And then with automation, computers came in after a while the cutting systems now are pretty sophisticated. I mean, they're so accurate that they can place all the grooves as close as possible to each other, no matter what is being cut, whether there's a lot of vertical information, a lot of lateral information, if there's a lot of information on just one channel, it doesn't matter. It completely computes and puts those grooves as close together as you can, so you can save the most space. So we've come pretty far when it comes to vinyl, but like I said, there are still various limitations. But the faster you go, the better. So these audiophile records that are 45 RPM are going to track better because the signal is spread out, and that cartridge, the stylus, is able to follow the little nuances in the groove better. It's like an accordion; it gets expanded, especially out on the outer edge. But if it's going 45 RPM, it's even better than a 33 because it's just that much more material is going by that cutting tool.
Are there still half-speed masters being done?
Not that I know of. I mean, that was a problem because it was pretty good for high end in a way, but it was very bad for low end because a cutting system does not like to cut 15 cycles. And half speed meant that 30 cycle information is now 15. And even tape machines, they don't reproduce 15 cycles very well. So you have to have big, beefy equalizers on the, and this degrades the sound. So the bottom end was never really great on half speed mastering. The high end was pretty good, but we have cartridges that are pretty good on high end now. And it had to do with the cutting systems too. Cutting systems had a little more trouble with 15,000 and 20,000 cycles. So in some ways, maybe it was a little better in the high end, but the bottom end, most people complained about it. It just, they could not come up with the right equalization to compensate for what happens when you half speed everything.
So let's say 20, 25 years ago, when they were doing a lot of half speed masters, we've now made that shift. Rather than doing a half-speed master, just speed up the record. Let's make some 45 RPM, 12 inches.
Yeah, absolutely. That does help. I remember when I was working on a Ella Fitzgerald thing, like a reissue for audiophiles, like we had some siblings with her, and the guy that I was working with, I says, hey, because our cutting system, we can actually go up to 78 RPM. And I said, well, this S is not tracking very well, but let's see what it does at 78. See if it tracks it, and it tracked perfectly. But it wouldn't track at 33. So it's a way of proving that the cutting system is actually putting it in the groove. It's just that, and the cutting system doesn't care how fast the disc is going. It's going to move the way it needs to move, depending on the signal. It's the amount of material that goes by the cutting tool that's going to determine how well it tracks. So that's why on the outer edge, it tracks cleaner.
If we jump forward 10 or 20 years, what sort of evolutions do you believe will be in the vinyl record sphere?
Well, I mean, there are various things that I've heard about. They're trying all kinds of experimental things. There's even some place in is it Copenhagen or somewhere in the Netherlands or something, where they're actually going to try to do the cutting with a laser. But it's for vinyl discs, but they're going to try to cut the master with lasers. Now, the problem with that is, though, you have to convert it probably to, there's going to be some conversion things there so that you can operate the laser. So, I mean, I don't know. A lot of times you might be able to cut maybe a little more accurately with something, what you have to do to make it do that, you degrade the sound. It's always been the problem, because, like, as far as I'm concerned, sometimes when you make an amplifier or a preamp or something ultra flat, you're looking for really wide frequency response and everything, but what you have to do sometimes to make it really, really ruler flat degrades the sound. So who cares? The main thing is the quality of sound as far as I'm concerned. If the spectrum is not perfectly flat, if it's really clean, you're going to like it better. So, I mean, even if there's even a mix that's not perfect, if it's not been manipulated a lot and it's really, really clean, you're going to pick out all the instruments, no problem. But if it's a dirty sound, everything's fighting for attention because everything's smeared. So I'd rather have clean than perfect ruler flat. And besides, there's no speaker that's flat when it comes to speakers and things like that. And none of them match perfectly. So you're always going to have poorer sound on the phantom channel than you do on the right or left. And you've probably noticed that on some of these old jazz records, when the instrument comes in on the right or left, it's way cleaner than when it's in the center. Because there's all that acoustical cancellation and adding when you have two speakers reproducing the same thing. And the same thing happens with cutter heads. Because think of it this way too. A cutter head is basically two speakers with a cutting tool hooked to it instead of a cone. So it's that primitive, basically, but it's pretty elaborate too, because it's got two coils on it, it's got emotional feedback, it's got all kinds of ways of stabilizing the system. So it's pretty sophisticated, but getting back to what I originally said, it's basically a pretty primitive system.
That's absolutely fascinating. And with the, as you said, vinyl dates back to the 19th century. Why?
Vinyl. I mean, Edison had a foil. It was some kind of metal foil, and he was cutting vertically. The stylus was only moving up and down, and that's a way you can cut records. You can cut them vertically. And that's what he had. But of course, it's evolved into all kinds of other things. But the basic principle was there.
And with vinyl technology being 100 years old, really conceptually, and then of course it's evolved and become better and better. Why, with all the digital formats and options, why do you personally feel that vinyl has made this big comeback?
Well, there's a few reasons. Now, I think young people like it because, they've kind of grown up with like playlists, and they've also kind of like been slightly detached in some ways from the music. When they go to concerts, they're not so detached, and when they leave the concert, they want a T-shirt or something like that as to keep that contact with the artist. Well, that's what vinyl is. It's a big format. It gets them involved. It gets them to focus on what they're going to be listening to. It's almost like looking at really good titles in a movie. When you go to the movie, that sets you up for listening and getting involved. And that's what they're finding. They're finding that people that are playing vinyl, they have to stop what they're doing. That's what we all have to do. They have to stop what they're doing, take the record out of the jacket. They're looking at the jacket too. They're connecting with the artist. They're putting it on the turntable. They're putting the arm on the record, the cartridge, the stylus on the record. They tend to actually sit down and listen. And they don't, a lot of kids nowadays, they're not really listening that close. It's going on. They're on their computer. They're on playing games. They're on their cell phone. They're on this. They're on that. I've even heard of stories of young teenagers now sitting around and getting together and listening to records. Think of that.
Yep.
That's what we all did.
Coming back around.
I mean, it's a very appealing format, but what they don't understand, I think, is that it's delicate. because it's analog and anything on that disc you're going to hear, you have to take care of those things, or else they're going to get noisy. They're going to get scratched. You put your fingers all over it. It's going to track dirt. I mean, there are a lot of problems with vinyl as well, but they love that format and they love the big pictures and they can read about it while they're listening to it. It's actually they're more connected in a way, in a lot of ways. So, and with the audiophile end of it, I think as long as you're recording something, some of these things that were done all analog, you're going to get something that's a little more natural sounding than the CD that was made from it, from the masters and stuff, because it stays analog, all the way through. Because when things get digitalized, when we're cutting, like if I were to mix down something and I mix it first generation to analog and then to digital, if I cut that analog tape onto a vinyl disc, and then I cut the same thing, the one that was mixed to the digital, and I cut the same thing, it won't track quite the same way though, because digital tends to have these harder transients, harder, edgier transients. And there is an area that's harder for the playback cartridge to track. So it tends to actually be not as clean when it gets on the vinyl.
Now, audibly, can you tell the difference between a record that was cut from a tape master and a CD master?
Not necessarily. No, I mean, because if it's going to track, I mean, that doesn't mean that it's not going to track clean. I'm just saying it's more susceptible to it when it's in the digital format because of that harder edge. But sometimes it's not, doesn't go beyond the limitations of the playback cartridge, and it sounds fine. I mean, there are certain other artifacts that kind of draw attention to the digital thing, because there is a certain sound that digital has that's not musical. If they've done a lot of processing, trying to make things loud, digital plugins that do various other things, there's definitely, it's like this. It's like you got a photograph that's got reds and greens and blues. And when you put it through all this digital processing and all that, the reds and the greens and the blues are still there, but now everything has this little bit of a yellow tint on it. Everything. And that's the difference. It's not that those colors aren't still there, but they're not only there. They're not like separated and very distinct. They have this other sound. And that's why a lot of digital things, if you listen to especially stuff that's processed a lot, pop stuff, everything almost sounds has a certain fingerprint on it. It's got a sound on all of the instruments, on everything. It's like having a little fuzz on your TV all the time. That's what I noticed.
So, Bernie, you've recently done some very large projects, the Pink Floyd remasters. You're doing the Blue Note remasters, essentially creating what may well be the final representation of those masterpieces for future generations. Do you feel the importance of that work while you're doing it, or is it just another day in the office?
No, I do, especially, I mean, when it comes to Pink Floyd, that's a little bit different. See, that's from files that have already been determined ahead of time. I'm just trying to do a real faithful transfer on our systems, which are all kind of pretty custom around here. We do a lot of our own construction and adjustments on these systems. But now the Blue Note stuff was a different story. That's a labor of love for me. Remember, I'm a bebopper. Mm-hmm. And so that, also coming from all those master tapes, we actually built a signal chain special for that job because there were so many albums that they wanted us to do. And we also had a turntable in here and we got original pressings that Rudy Van Gelder did. And we were trying to make sure we had the same sound stage that he had, because Don who was in charge of the project, wanted him to have that. He felt that there was a certain kind of magic in all those Blue Notes from the past. So we were trying to keep the same sound stage, but just cleaner and more accurate. So we built this special chain that had minimal electronics and not even a lot of adjustment, because with jazz records, I don't think it just isn't as complicated when you equalize and adjust or whatever you're going to do to it. You don't need as many frequency ranges and various things like that, which can degrade the sound. We were going all out to go to a computer that we actually built ourselves and only licensed the software. And that computer, we were doing 96, 24, and 192, 24 masters for their archives and their files that could be you could use them for anything. You could put them on vinyl. You could make it into an MFIT for iTunes. Whatever you needed to change, you could change the sampling rates or whatever. But the main ones that were going to be on file were going to be these high resolution ones. So that was the object, to come up with like a final mastered version that they could just use it. They wouldn't have to worry about equalization and all that stuff. So that was the goal. And so that's why we there were so many of them. That's why we went to a lot of trouble to try to get these things so that they would be perfect, or as close to perfect as possible.
I guess with Blue Note, because they had that consistency with Rudy Van Gelder, that the investment in doing it once, setting up the system and the processes to be able to replicate that soundstage, you could then work with other Blue Note masters to leverage that same work.
Yeah, that does make it easier, because he had a certain way that he did things, and all we needed to do was to be able to adjust how close together the left and right channels were, and just like a 2-band EQ, just high and low end, different ranges, different areas. I think it had, I'm trying to think, I haven't done that for a while, but I think it had 2 or 3 ranges for each channel. But that was it. I mean, we have 36 ranges when we're doing pop stuff. So it's, because we need to manipulate it sometimes a lot more, because that pop stuff gets so dense that when you're trying to get something to adjust and get just one area to come out a little better or whatever it is, you need to manipulate a lot of different ranges in order to do that. So, but with Rudy's stuff, that was kind of almost pretty much direct to 2-track stuff. So it was right down my alley. It's just like contemporary records.
You mentioned the archival format, and we recently had on the show Greg Brooks, who he looks after the Queen archive. And this is becoming a bit of an industry, because you now have artists like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and The Who and of course Queen and all the biggies, and even some of the not so biggies, that are archiving their work really for future generations. What is the preferred archival format for audio?
Well, now, see, I have my opinion, but I know when I was doing this stuff for Capitol on the Blue Note stuff, I told them, I said, I know you want 192 because it's a high resolution and it is pretty good quality, but I said, it's not going to last. Digital deteriorates. It's a very high density medium, and anything that goes wrong with that hard drive, you're in trouble. It's going to drop out. You're going to lose signal. The only way that I can think of that if you really wanted to archive something to last, say, 100 years, you'd have to put it on tape. That's the only way. Because I've heard tapes, even original tapes, that were done in the late 30s in Germany, because they'd invented tape and the tape recorders. And it was paper tape with oxide on it, and it still played. I heard one in the 90s. I think it was in the 1990s. And they had a commemorative CD that they did at one of the audio shows in Hamburg. And it was their first stereo recordings too in the late 30s. And they sounded quite good, but they were from these 1/4-inch tapes. Now, those Blue Note tapes, which are some of them 60 years old, were perfect. Everything played back perfectly. Because the only thing that really makes tape deteriorate is wide temperature changes or major high humidity.
The physical conditions.
Yeah, physical. And that's not all. Yeah, it's a physical thing that happens to it, but you also a tape that's been run a lot of times. If you run it through a machine, which stresses it, because if you really pull on it, this has a plastic base. So if you just take the tape and yank on it and stretch it, the oxide starts to come off. Just like paint would if there was paint on something that like a rubber band. So it would start shedding, but it's usually that never happens. But a tape like say if it's on 1/4 inch, which is a little more delicate because it's more susceptible to try to stretch when it's running through a tape machine. Like if it's an album that sold a lot of copies and we had to cut lots of masters, especially at the beginning of the reel, the beginning of it, where the hub is small, the take-up reel is small and the tape is bent around that hub, and there's a lot of those old machines had more tension at the beginning, so there's stress on the tape. If we have any damage from that, it's usually the first tune. From it being stressed on those old tape machines. But see, the old European machines, the Studers and stuff like that, and the new ones, of course, all the new ones that came out I think they were probably in the 60s. I mean, that far back, but they knew about this problem, and those machines had constant tension. So there was the same amount of tension on the take-up reel at all times. So there's a little adjusters on those machines that sense the amount of tension, which is really very sophisticated. So and they don't even, when you're winding the tape, the Studers lift the tape from the heads, but the lifters have rollers. So the tape is never scraping over anything unless it's on the playback head. So there are various things you can do to preserve it, but the thing is, if you're going to archive something, you're not going to run it a lot of times. You're going to make an archive copy and put it away. And that's what I told them. I said, hey, if you really wanted to preserve this, make a 30 IPS 1/4 inch copy. And they didn't want to do it. There's this perception, that it's old fashioned maybe. I don't know. Now there's only one other way that I know of that you could preserve it, and maybe even for a longer period of time. And that is if you took the mother. Now that you're assuming now that the mother's perfect, and it probably isn't. But in the pressing plant, and they do this out at RTI, one of the pressing plants here, you could take the mother, and there's a kind of like rubbery kind of material that they can coat it with, the side with all of the grooves and stuff. They fill it all in and coat it with this rubbery kind of elastic stuff that fills all the grooves and preserves it and protects it from oxidation and so forth. And that probably would last a long time. But either one, that's the only two, because if you don't spin up those hard drives every 5 years or so, or make another copy to a new hard drive, you're going to lose it. It won't spin up after a while. And this has happened. And the problem is, like, look at DATs. Nobody services DATs anymore. You can't play DATs. You might find a machine that'll play it, but maybe in a few years, when it breaks down, they don't make parts for any DAT machines anymore, anywhere. It's a dead issue. And that's what happens sometimes with digital. Formats go. But the thing is, tape machines are so simple, and there were so many of them made, that you could just build one if you had to 100 years from now. If you had a tape, you could actually probably build one or find some old beat up thing and clean it up and it would play. Because a professional machine has three motors, have take up, supply motor, and a drive motor. It's pretty simple. So you could make things work. So, but digital is much, much more complicated.
So in your mind, the way to archive, nothing beats tape.
Nothing beats tape. No.
Excellent. So, Bernie, thank you very much for spending time with us. This has been very informative. I've had a head full of stuff here. I've remained very quiet. I feel very much like a student listening to a professor, a master, talk about their craft. It's really been quite humbling and quite fun. Just one final question.
Yeah.
In terms of your listening to music, if you had an hour left in your life, what album do you put on, and in what format?
I'd probably put on like some of those old, really great sounding jazz albums, like Sonny Rollins' Colossus, Saxophone Colossus, which was a great sounding album. Or I don't know. I would probably put on Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra, one of my favorite pieces of music by Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony. Beautiful recording, done way back in the late 50s. But still to this day would be hard to beat.
I don't know too much about the classical one, but Sonny Rollins' Saxophone Colossus, that's quite a hard to find record. Do you have original pressings? Do you have a record collection?
Oh, yeah, I have thousands.
Oh, wow.
That's what I was doing when I was a teenager. All my money went to equipment and records.
And you've kept them all throughout the years.
Well, I don't have all of them, but I have quite a few of them, yeah.
So, and how many hours a day, when you get home, do you put on a record, or are your ears tired? You just need to rest them?
I tend to just spend the night with my wife, and I usually listen I get up much earlier than my wife. So I have a listening room with a bathroom connected right to it. So I just leave the door open, but I'm usually playing CDs then, because they're easier, and they're less, they're not so delicate. So I just throw on a CD, and have that playing fairly high level while I take my shower and get ready for work. So, but still, there are certain vinyl records that just have a certain magic to them that I like to play.
Yep, that's exactly what we're chasing as well, Bernie. I want to thank you for spending time with the Vinyl Guide audience. We really are fascinated and appreciative of the work that you've done, and really, again, enjoy hearing your stories and your thoughts and your perspective on why the records that we love sound so good. And keep doing what you're doing. Thanks again for everything, Bernie.
Yeah, well, thank you.